Everything starts in a large sunlit mansion. No one chooses to be born, but everyone has to keep living, and she was not an exception to this rule, so she continued just like everyone else. But the universe was full of surprises, and a woman with black hair and green eyes lying down is awakened by another woman calling her. The woman sits up slowly in her bed and asks if she is visiting the imperial palace that day, aware that somehow she ended up in that world. The other woman agrees and says she has prepared a bath for her. During the bath, as no one noticed that something was wrong with the owner of that body, the protagonist imagines she is doing well in her role as a noble. In this world, there is a crown prince, knights patrol the streets, and there are sacred powers and magic. In simple terms, she entered a romance novel she read a few days ago and became the villain of the story. Her character was the only daughter of a marquis and the fiancée of the crown prince, Eris Mazirian. Eris is dressed by the maids in a beautiful red dress, reflecting that some people would love to live in such a world, but for her, it was different. A voice breaks her thoughts and asks what she was so distracted about. Eris responds that she just thought about how time passes slowly, and the maid brushing her hair smiles, mentioning she must be anxious for her engagement. Actually, she was scared. It was impossible to feel comfortable in that place and in that body. In order to return to her original world, the protagonist was determined to die as quickly as possible. In the original novel, the Crown Prince Alec falls in love with the daughter of a former count, Helena, and their love blossoms until they finally marry, with Helena becoming empress. Meanwhile, the fate of Eris, who loved Alec and envied Helena, collapses as she furiously seeks revenge, never forgiving Helena. That was what Helena deserved for stealing what belonged to her. Blinded by envy and a sense of inferiority, Eris poisons Helena and is executed. After that, Helena is revived by the high priest and the story ends with a happy ending. The character Eris was not important in the work, and her only purpose was to serve as an obstacle to the happy ending that Helena was supposed to achieve. It was a generic and typical romance novel, which honestly the protagonist was not even a big fan of. Readers who preferred Helena, the heroine, were probably quite satisfied with the ending. During her carriage ride, despite her serious expression, Eris could only think that she wanted to die soon. She makes her way to the palace and is greeted by a man and a knight that afternoon, informing her that the prince awaits her, and Eris thanks them, saying Alec was indeed kind. But mentally she laughs at her own words. After all, Alec doesn't care at all about Eris in reality. There was only one person his eyes resided on, and it was clear who it was when the protagonist walks to the gardens where he is. A girl with silver hair and violet eyes diverts her attention from the prince and waves to Eris, happy to see that she arrived. The prince looks at Eris and mentions that she is late, not seeming very pleased. The protagonist holds the hem of her dress and apologizes, mentioning it is a beautiful afternoon and greeting them. Helena smiles and says that the tea is still warm, inviting Eris to sit, to which Alec corrects her to speak more informally, as they were all friends there. Helena was originally a noble, but became a commoner when her father lost the title. The reason they all became childhood friends was because the queen hired Helena's mother to be Alec's nanny. Normally, this would be the point where Eris would intimidate Helena and be dismissed by the crown prince, but she was too tired to pick fights. So, the protagonist sits down and asks if they could serve a new cup of tea, as cold tea was bitter, and Helena agrees immediately, still smiling. The prince asks if she hadn't learned to serve her own tea, or if there was something wrong with her hands. But Eris retorts that he himself said they were friends, and drinks her tea while asking what is wrong with asking a friend for a cup of tea. This catches Alec's attention, but Eris knew he couldn't pick a fight at this point, until Helena touches the prince's arm and agrees that she was right, and that she served because they were friends, joking that she wouldn't serve Alec tea if he keeps complaining like that, looking bright and sweet as she spoke. The protagonist thinks that Helena was always pure and honest. There was no one who didn't like her, no matter what she did. In fact, she was loved by everyone, and it was visible just by the way the girls smiled. Suddenly, a fourth person approaches and says he feels abandoned, and hugs Alec and Helena from behind with a big smile. It was a man with red hair named Jason, asking if they were having a party without him. Helena excitedly asks if he had already returned, and Jason agrees, saying he would stay in the capital for a while. Jason Kazal was the eldest son of the Duke, known as Jason the Warrior, and was just another obstacle in Helena's romance whose feelings were unreciprocated. The protagonist realizes they were ignoring her, as expected, and continues to drink her tea calmly. Until Jason looks up at Eris and apologizes, asking where his manners were. He winks and smiles at her, saying that Eris looked as beautiful as ever. As Jason sits down, Eris responds that it was a lovely afternoon, and the man replies that he did not deserve to be called by his title of Sir, asking to be called just by his name. This makes Eris ask how she could do that when she was the fiancée of the Crown Prince. Alec becomes visibly irritated, and she knew it was because he couldn't hide his emotions well, certainly furious, because she emphasized the term fiancé in front of Helena. The redhead gestures that there are many eyes around and nods towards the Crown Prince, to which Alex says he has nothing to worry about concerning what other people think of him. Eris replies that only one person in this world doesn't have to worry about others, but even he worries about his enemies. Her words make Helena raise her voice, calling for Eris, and everyone falls into an uncomfortable silence as the prince glares at her with clear anger. It was obvious this would happen since she practically insinuated that even the emperor doesn't act as if he were all-powerful, which was strange because although Eris was their childhood friend, she was still treated like a nuisance. She probably should be upset about this, at least that's what would happen if she were the real Eris. So, the protagonist stands up from the table and politely thanks Helena for the tea, which catches the silver-haired girl's attention. Eris says she shouldn't speak informally with the prince, and with her inside the palace, as status and class should be respected in front of others. Helena lowers her eyes and hesitantly agrees with her thought, until the crown prince angrily punches the table, drawing attention to himself. He glares at the protagonist furiously and questions how she dared to scold her that way in his presence. This reaction made Helena try to prevent the conflict Alec was starting. And despite the prince's insistence, the girl says she's fine and asks him to stop arguing with Eris, holding his fist on the table. The two fall silent as they look at each other for a moment. Because Helena was so kind, she never complains even when she was truly upset. Eris thinks she really didn't even need to do that because she had more people than she needed by her side to defend her in all circumstances. This makes her leave the table silently because none of this matters if Eris herself is the only one who hates her. Walking under the strong sun, she covers her eyes with her hand and realizes that the makeup and accessories on her body were too heavy. A servant helps her into the carriage and asks if she had a pleasant afternoon, which makes her look at the servant in silence before agreeing that it was good. After sitting in her place, Eris tells them to depart, and the coachman agrees with her orders. She even thinks it was a beautiful day to hang herself, but obviously she wouldn't do that, as it would be useless since she wouldn't die anyway. Sitting on the couch, the protagonist considers having tried everything she could to return to her original world. Everything indeed, especially with a book with a symbol on the cover in her lap. Eris jumped off a balcony, leaving the servants shocked as she fell. She drank poison she found hidden without hesitation and fainted before being found by servants. And she even tried to use a dagger to attack herself, but taking her own life in various ways resulted in nothing. The principle of causality in this world wouldn't allow her to escape Eris's predetermined story. The coachman caught her when she jumped off the balcony once. The poison she took was actually a sleeping potion, and even when she used the dagger, where various maids were desperately begging the doctor to help Eris. The story just continued, assuming she was attacked by an assassin, but her life was not really in danger, which was ridiculous. She gets frustrated to the point of touching her own head, because she certainly wouldn't be so upset if it wasn't so painful. Whenever she tried to return to her world, some supernatural event occurs and prevents her from doing so. So now she would have to retaliate in a different way. The protagonist approaches a maid named Emma and asks her to go and find a good seer and to be discreet. Later, she returned to her room and picked up a yellow hat, considering that this should work, until the maid called her. She holds 2 other hats and says excitedly that Eris hasn't visited the city for a while, suggesting she dress up a bit more, which doesn't excite the protagonist. Emma insists that she should do some shopping in the city and could also eat something tasty, which makes the protagonist decide to think about it. The maid mentions that there was plenty of time before sunset, so she shouldn't rush and should enjoy the day, talking about the new bakery famous for its cookies. Eris mentions that it seemed Emma was more interested in those sweets, especially for being so excited while dressing her. The maid laughs and agrees that she was indeed, because sweets improved her mood, but now she just wished Eris would feel better. The protagonist responds that she would bring some sweets if they were really good, but she would be in trouble if they were bad. Her response makes the maid smile, as it sounded more like the usual Eris, and she realizes that everyone there loved their milady. Still, it made her wonder if the real Eris loved those people too. Anyway, she makes her way to the city where various people walked peacefully in the streets. Considering there were firearms in the holsters of knights, she supposes that the story's setting was more modern times than medieval. The street lights are developed by magical engineering, but it was ironic that it was prevalent in a world where mages are considered heretics. The coachman announces Eris' arrival in the city, and she looks out of the carriage window, pulling back the curtain. The protagonist gets off the carriage and says they could return now because she wanted to stroll alone, and the knight refuses because she had been attacked before and it was dangerous to walk alone. This makes her insist that she didn't want to repeat herself, as they would only get in her way, sending them home. The knight becomes nervous with the reprimand, but finally agrees with the milady's orders, suggesting that he would at least stay nearby and return when she finished her errands, which makes Eris satisfied. She walks through the city and enters a shop full of trinkets that makes her think it didn't look like a fortune teller's shop, running her fingers over a book that caught her attention, looking quite interesting, until a voice says that she wouldn't touch that if she were her. Looking back, Eris sees a woman with short red hair approaching, which makes her say she came there for a reading, and as she weren't a charlatan, she should know what was bothering her without needing that, and the woman agrees, then mentioning she could refer to her as a poor foreigner, smiling at Eris. The protagonist stays silent at the comment and stares at the fortune teller for a long moment, until the redhead approaches and holds her hand, asking her to follow, which surprises Eris. But they both go deeper into the shop and pass through a curtain to another room where Eris sits, saying this should be easy since the fortune teller knew who she was, mentioning she just wanted to return to her original world. The fortune teller responds that she made it sound so simple, but it certainly wasn't, and besides, she only discovered it by the smell of her soul, but Eris had tried different methods on her own. The protagonist asks about the smell of her soul, and the fortune teller agrees that this was the method of discovery. After all, she tried to destroy her own soul, but the world didn't allow her to do that to the end. This makes Eris go silent, thinking it didn't seem like the fortune teller was just guessing. The redhead turns to rummage through some trinkets and asks for a moment to find something, pouring some liquids into a large pot with a sort of bubbling pink mixture, which makes the protagonist curious to know what exactly she was doing, until the woman returns to the table and places a jar in front of Eris, asking her to drink it all. The protagonist asks if it was really safe to drink this, and the redhead puts her hand on her face, saying that even if it were poisoned, it should align with her interest. The comment makes Eris stare at the drink in the teacup with tension on her face, and finally set her fears aside, drinking the whole liquid at once without thinking twice. That's when she started choking and covered her mouth with her hand, desperate. And the fortune teller approaches to hand her a sweet that would help with the taste, making Eris glare at her because she was being treated like a child. The redhead sits in front of the protagonist, saying she wasn't an ordinary fortune teller and Eris should have realized that by now. Then, she moves her fingers and a purple light appears in the palm of her right hand. The sight makes the protagonist stare at the redhead intensely, and she introduces herself as Medea, the last witch of that world. Eris is surprised because she didn't remember there being any witches mentioned in the original novel. Medea says that she must have many questions, but she would answer them all as much as possible. This makes Eris ask what happened to all the other witches, and Medea explains that she is the only one left on the continent, as the others fled the persecution and live far away from there. The protagonist asks if they didn't have a surname or families, and the seer responds that some decided to have children, but it was rare because they valued individuality. And as they considered themselves as sisters, they usually only used their first names and did not use surnames. This silences Eris, realizing that despite still having many questions, there was only one thing she really wanted to know. So, she asks her to tell a way to return to her original world, which brings a smile to the witch's face. Medea says that if she is willing to risk her own life for this, they could help her, but Eris was the first foreigner she knew, so she would need to seek the help of other witches. The uncertainty of how long it would take makes Eris ask, and Medea considers that at least 2 weeks, but she would need to be patient because her sisters live far away. The protagonist hesitates and squeezes her fingers in her lap, asking what would happen if she didn't want to risk her own life, which makes Medea respond slowly that this was not something she could answer for her, because she didn't know the difference between theology and magic, where theology was divine creation, and magic was distorting the laws of nature. So if she sought a solution that did not yet exist, she needed to consult the priests at the cathedral, but she couldn't guarantee answers there. Eris gets up from her seat, saying she understands, leaving payment on the table for her to keep a secret despite Medea mentioning it was fine. But since the witch's secret was even bigger than Eris's, she believes she wouldn't be betrayed by Medea. The redhead remains silent at this realization and says she seems to have no choice but to accept it, taking the bag with the payment, and says she would contact the milady when she discovers something, then suggests that the protagonist keep a mirror with her all the time. Upon leaving, Eris thinks that it was the first time she encountered new characters since she entered that story. Only time would tell if this was good or bad, and she could only move things forward as they were. Walking through the streets, she wonders why it was so crowded with people around. That's when she realizes, surprised, that there was a huge line for the entrance to a bakery. She realizes this was the confectionery Emma mentioned earlier, and she wonders if all those people were queuing to enter. Eris thinks that no matter how tasty it is, she wouldn't wait in line, being sure she could buy sweets another time. Until she accidentally bumps into another person and lets out a cry of pain and twists her ankle. But before she can fall, a pair of hands holds her by the arms, and the protagonist's body is supported. Looking back, she sees a priest with dark hair and eyes asking if she was okay, which makes Eris realize that it matched the description of a character from the novel. The priest releases her and says he is relieved she wasn't hurt, but the protagonist still thinks he should be the person who brought Helena back to life with his sacred powers, and prayed for Eris to go to hell after she was executed for her actions against Helena. This was the high priest Hubris, who was now smiling at her, unaware that he would be someone she would hate in the future. The two stare at each other for a moment until the priest notices something and approaches the protagonist, and then asks who she was, which shocks Eris with what she just heard. She can't even breathe under the pressure of his gaze, as if he was seeing through her soul. Eris wonders if she should be honest with Hubris and ask for his help right now about her problems. Hubris was one of the male protagonists of the novel. After Helena dies, he sacrifices all his sacred power to revive her, so he was one of her future enemies. If Hubris discovers she isn't the real Eris, he might use her for some kind of strange experiment. If the prince knows the truth, he might accuse her of insanity and banish her to some deserted island to do worse things. She couldn't allow anything like that to happen and nervously holds the hem of her dress. Eris asks if he was interested in her identity because it was strange for a priest to ask about a single woman. The priest remains silent before saying he wasn't referring to her social status, untouched by her words. Eris asks what he was referring to, insisting on her point. People around them gossip about the conversation, recognizing her as the fiancée of the crown prince and wondering what Eris was doing there. The priest looks away and says they shouldn't argue there, and Eris thinks that due to his position, he is careful about how others see him. As the crown prince's fiancée, Eris was famous, and talking to a man in priestly robes would certainly draw attention. The protagonist says that he questioned her in a threatening tone, but still refuses to explain. The comment makes Hubris nervous, and he gestures with his hand that he would never do anything like that. But she interrupts him, stating she felt interrogated, and surely the most important part was how the interrogator feels. And she steps closer to the priest, mentioning that if she touched him now, it could be considered a type of harassment. Hubris looks away and nervously says he was mistaken, apologizing to Eris. She accepts his apology and gives a small smile, realizing she managed to get rid of his questions. Then she walks past him and bids farewell, leaving him behind despite Hubris looking over his shoulder in her direction. In the carriage on the way back home, the protagonist feels a bit regretful for doing that, thinking she should have been honest with him from the beginning. He was the high priest, and Eris wouldn't have many opportunities to go to the cathedral to get information. Despite Medea saying there might be a way to return to her world without dying, she would still need to go to the cathedral to find out. This makes her place her hand on her forehead, thinking she should have asked Hubris directly, regretting her previous actions. It wasn't fair to have to risk her life just to go back home. Eris didn't want to feel pain again. But begging for help from a man who despises her was much better than losing her life. She only skimmed the novel, so she didn't know much about what would happen later in the story. She just hoped she could meet Hubris again as soon as possible so they could talk. Eris returns home late at night in her carriage, escorted by knights. She gets off the carriage and the knight mentions that the commendation ceremony is coming up, asking if she wouldn't name a personal knight this year. Even though she doesn't need to if she doesn't want to, he says it would be advantageous to have a personal protector to accompany her, useful for both official and private matters. Eris remains silent, considering it would indeed be good to help her with her personal matters, but she refuses, wondering what good it would do to hire more servants when she would be leaving soon. The knight follows her on the way back, saying it was a pity because there were many knights who wanted to serve her. It was anyone's dream to swear their life to a beautiful lady. The protagonist sighs and responds that it was a useless dream, questioning whether swearing loyalty to a pretty lady wasn't pointless, and she didn't want anyone's life tied to hers. Eris says that other people might be happy having someone devoted to them, but she was different, and looks at the knight, saying he should seek to live for himself, because she had no intention of carrying the weight of another person's life or helping someone achieve a dream. Meanwhile, in the city, Hubris loved sweets and could see the bakery full of customers in the distance. But due to his position as a priest, he had to enjoy his tastes in secret and in moderation. Helena approached, handing him a package, apologizing because she couldn't enter the cathedral as a commoner, giving him leaf-shaped cookies he liked. Hubris asks if she waited in line just for that and takes the package of cookies, and she says she was at the bakery when she remembered the priest. This makes him apologize for giving her the trouble, but Helena smiles, saying it's okay because the cookies taste better when shared with others. As a priest, Hubris always lived a life of moderation, and Helena's words moved his heart, making him thank her. It was thanks to Helena that he became able to express himself more freely. Meanwhile, Eris spent the entire night trying, but this was the only thing she could remember about the priest's unrequited love. Since Hubris was near the bakery the day before when they met, the protagonist assumes he hasn't fallen in love with Helena yet. She had to reach him before anyone else, because if he loves Helena, he would never consider helping Eris. But based on his character, it was unlikely he would share his secret with those around him. Eris thinks that the bakery was the place where she had the best chance of meeting the priest again. If she waits until he visits the Imperial Palace, the possible scenario would be one where having a private conversation with the priest wouldn't make the Crown Prince happy. Alec would become ill after having a fit of rage, thinking she was seducing the priest, and would report her to the Emperor. She didn't intend to interfere with Helena's sweet and boring romance with anyone there. But she had no choice and decided to go out and wait for Hubris in front of the bakery to find the opportunity to see him again. Suddenly, when the protagonist touched the door handle, a voice asked if she was awake. And this voice said that Eris should hurry to get ready because the Emperor requested her presence at the palace. The protagonist is surprised by the Emperor's sudden request. Later, she dressed in a purple gown and presented herself before the Emperor with a greeting on that beautiful afternoon. The Emperor, on his throne, apologizes for calling her so suddenly and hopes it wasn't inconvenient, to which Eris says it is an honor to see him. In fact, she felt a bit nauseous after having to get ready in such a hurry all of a sudden. The Emperor notes that she has become quite eloquent and mentions that he called her to discuss a coming-of-age ceremony, stating that there is no precedent for this, but he would like to celebrate her coming of age within the Imperial Palace. The reason the Emperor wanted to celebrate at the palace was the rumor that the Crown Prince was neglecting Eris due to his affection for a commoner. It was a great insult to Marquis Nazarian, who asks his servant if the Emperor was aware of this, to the servant's nervousness. But it was clear he knew, and although the Marquis had not yet said it, it was obvious he was furious with the situation. The engagement between the prince and Eris was a political strategy by the Emperor to form ties with the aristocracy. To show that the marriage would happen as planned, he decided to celebrate her coming of age at the palace in respect of the fiancé. Eris thanks the Emperor, saying it would be a great honor for her family, knowing there is no point in refusing since he would get what he wants in the end. The Emperor mentions that Alec is close to his nanny's daughter Helena and asks if Eris knows her, and she says they played together as children alongside Alec and Jason. This makes the monarch consider that this happened because the empress hired the count's wife as a nanny, always being too tolerant with the prince. Eris realizes he is acting like a kind grandfather now, but he was a ruthless man who even killed his own son. The first prince was executed for treason without any evidence presented, and the empress survived only because she was pregnant with Alec. She lost the child overnight due to a false accusation, so it was understandable that she would bring a friend who was also struggling to be her nanny. The turn of the conversation makes the emperor ask if Eris was jealous of Helena, and she denies the question, which satisfies him as there was no reason for such a thing. He asks her to come closer, and Eris holds her dress to do as ordered. The emperor holds Eris's hand, saying that a man's love is transient, and more importantly, the status and power he can provide. Therefore, she shouldn't worry about anything because he made a promise to Eris's father a long time ago that she would become the next empress. Then, the people who support her will fill this palace, and her son will become the next heir. He asks if she can understand this point, and although it seemed like he was comforting her, the emperor said all this hiding a threat, stating that Eris Mazirian would become the crown princess, and there is nothing she can do to avoid it. The protagonist agrees with the emperor's words and says she would keep all this in mind. But she thinks he chose the wrong person for his plans because Eris not only wasn't afraid of death, but was an outsider who didn't care at all about anything. As she leaves the palace, she wonders if, as the prince's fiancé, she should go see him before leaving the castle, considering that it didn't seem like a good day for that, because after receiving that blessing on her marriage, she didn't think she would handle Alec bothering her well. On her way, suddenly a hand grabs the protagonist by the shoulder, and she lets out a scream before looking back. Eris remains silent before saying that Helena scared her and asks why she would do something like that. The girl smiles nervously, saying she saw her passing by and just wanted to greet her, which makes the protagonist ask her to just speak normally instead of jumping on her childishly, and Helena mentions that it was something Alec liked, stuttering a bit. But this doesn't convince Eris, and she slaps her own forehead because not even a 5-year-old would act like that. That's when her attention turns to Helena's left hand, still sitting on the ground, and she extends her hand to help the girl up after realizing Helena hurt herself in the fall. As she stood up, Helena said she was fine and that she could be treated by the imperial physician, to which Eris asked why a royal family doctor should care for her. Helena smiled cheerfully, saying that the physician was always kind to her. The protagonist was surprised with herself for worrying about Helena when she should be taking care of herself, possibly being punished for accidentally hurting Helena. The girl asked if Eris was upset, and the protagonist agreed, telling her to stop talking to her before turning to leave despite Helena's apologies. She wondered how Helena could treat her informally after everything, and with her back turned, she asked if Helena knew why she should be treated formally even though she was a commoner. Turning around, she said that as the eldest daughter of a Marquis, she didn't need to be so polite to a servant, cutting off Helena's attempt to say something, explaining that the reason for treating her with such formality was because the Empress and the Crown Prince liked her. Helena said they were friends and she wished they were closer, which was why she talked to Eris. In the novel, Helena's thoughts only had room for Alec and Jason, and if Helena really considered Eris a friend, that would have been described. The author only wrote this friendship between them to make Eris seem even crueler and more malicious than she appeared to be. At this, the protagonist said they should stop being friends, catching Helena by surprise. Eris didn't want to be her friend, and it didn't make sense for them to have such a relationship, and Helena asked if it was because she was close to Alec. The protagonist was mentally irritated because she couldn't care less about the prince. After all, she would never abandon a friend just because of a man like that. The girl was indeed beautiful, but the protagonist couldn't deduce at all what was going through her mind. This made her say there were no reasons, and Helena should stop asking those questions. Until suddenly someone grabbed her wrist from behind, surprising Eris. It was the prince, who said she hadn't changed at all and was even more brazen than before. The protagonist greeted Alec and responded that she was acting according to her status. But he asked who she thought she was to mention status in front of him like that, clearly annoyed by her behavior. Eris didn't back down and stated she wasn't wrong. After all, he was her fiancé. This made him raise his voice, saying he could cancel the engagement whenever he wanted, choosing any other woman to marry, and Eris said she doubted the emperor would agree with that. He laughed because she was acting as if she were already the crown princess, letting go of the protagonist's wrist. But suppose that flattering the emperor was the only thing Eris was good at. That's when Helena asked him to stop talking, saying it was her fault that things had reached that point. She touched the prince's arm, saying Eris was only teaching her proper etiquette, until Alec noticed the injury on her hand and asked who hurt her. The girl hesitated and replied that it was okay because it didn't hurt, until someone shouted that they saw Eris hurting her. A woman pointed at the protagonist, yelling that Eris pushed Helena, which was why she ran to tell the prince before things got worse. The protagonist thought it was true that she pushed her, but wondered why they didn't mention the point where Helena jumped on her back and scared her. Helena realized what Alec was going to do and tried to stop him, but he took a step forward and slapped Eris in the face without hesitation. This caught the protagonist off guard, and she touched her own face, shocked by what had just happened. The prince said that since she hurt something that belonged to him, it was more than fair to do the same to her. Eris wondered how they could think that was fair, because if that were the case, it should have been Helena who slapped her. She recalled reading about this part in the original novel's script. At that time, she thought Alec was a lunatic, but now that she was living it personally, she was furious with the crown prince for being such a big idiot, considering hitting him too, but realizing that if she were imprisoned, it would only hinder her attempt to return to her original world, having to act like the real Eris so they wouldn't suspect her. Alec told Helena to leave with him, and the protagonist interrupted, saying that it was the emperor who made this agreement with the Marquis, not her. She wouldn't marry him but the imperial family, and even if he didn't want to, he would end up marrying her, and neither of them had a choice in this. The real Eris believed that the crown prince would choose her in the end instead of Helena, and would have acted proudly even in this situation. The prince replied that this point of view was indeed interesting. After all, she herself said she wanted to marry him because she had loved him for a long time, and asks if that was truly how she felt about him. The protagonist wonders what Eris was thinking when she considered loving that jerk. She recalls that at the end of the story, Helena told Eris that what she felt for the prince wasn't love, so her true feelings were unknown. But the protagonist wanted to respect Eris's love and replies to the prince that indeed she loved him, but doesn't love him anymore. She decides to be clear, and that she wasn't in the engagement by her own will, but because of the agreement between the Marquis and the Emperor. If he wanted to cancel the agreement, he could go ahead and talk to his own father instead of taking out his frustration on her, because she was sure the Emperor had already been informed of the current incident by this point. As Alec remains silent, Eris turned to leave, asking for permission to go. She leaves the garden and descends the stairs, where the knight notices the mark of the slap on her cheek when the protagonist tells them to leave. That's when he mentioned that Jason was waiting inside the carriage just as she was about to leave the palace. Upon entering the carriage, Jason smiles, greeting Eris and saying it was indeed a beautiful afternoon. He notices the mark on her face right when Eris asks him not to comment on it as it wasn't his business, and he agrees after hesitating for a moment. She asks what he was doing in her carriage, and Jason says that Duke Khazar has some questions for Marcus Mazirian about the knighthood ceremony, and he was given this task because he was the only one with free time, so he decided to hitch a ride with Eris since they were going to the same place. The protagonist replies that the palace would have lent him a carriage if he wanted, and he jokes that the carriage wouldn't come with a beautiful lady like her. This doesn't please her much because she knew Jason was more of a womanizer than a warrior, having a real knack for controlling the situation. Eris asks if he didn't have another expedition soon, and he says he's not sure because he killed the dragon that was considered Mother Nature and would hide in the capital for now. Although it was what he wanted, the other dragons didn't like Jason for what he did, which makes the protagonist ask if the dragon wanted him to kill it. She recalls that the book said Jason returned because he missed Helena, but there should have been other reasons too. Before Jason was born, the high priest prophesied that he would become the Dragon Slayer. The Khazar family was full of generals, but due to the prophecy, Jason underwent tougher training than anyone else and was beaten to the point of falling and dropping his sword. The novel begins when Jason returns to the palace after killing the dragon, and it was because he had to fall in love with Helena, the protagonist of the romance. He was only seen as a weapon, the Dragon Slayer, but when he met Helena, who only saw him as Jason, he fell madly in love with her. The protagonist thought Jason was just another character created by the author to be obsessed with Helena out of convenience. But she wonders if there could be another reason he was born as the Dragon Slayer. That's when Eris asked if he could tell a little about his journey now that they were traveling together to the Marquis' house. The man smiles and says it's unprecedented, not believing she wanted to hear about his stories, never expecting her to have any interest in him, and Eris clarifies that she had no interest, she just didn't want him to bother her with boring questions. She says he wouldn't have the chance to annoy her if he's busy telling his story, which makes him agree as he couldn't refuse a lady's request. Thus, Jason crosses his fingers in his lap and considers where to start, saying that the details of his birth and the prophecy are known on other continents, so he certainly doesn't need to explain. He dedicated blood, sweat, and tears to become the Dragon Slayer, learning to use a sword since birth and never being able to rest. There was a time when Jason held a grudge against his parents, but thinking about it now, he believed they made him go through all that to protect him. But he didn't know that at the time, and that's why he thought maybe everyone would be happier if he just disappeared. He knew he would end up killing dragons eventually, but didn't know when that would happen. Jason realized that the dragons, probably threatened by the prophecy, might appear to attack him first, and he's been worried about his family's safety ever since. So, he left home and began a new journey, all to become even stronger than before. But now that he thought about it, he could also see there were other reasons for leaving home. Living or dying was no longer important to him. He remembered Helena's words, saying that no matter where he was, she would always be by his side. In the end, he returned alive from his long journey. In the process, he ended up meeting many people on his travels. It was a wonderful experience where he could give gifts to children and drink alongside others. But the most important connection Jason made was undoubtedly another one. One day, he was in a city full of people like a crowd, where they shouted to move aside and make way for the princess. That connection was not with the princess of the neighboring empire who was in the carriage, certainly. The protagonist is surprised by this point in his narration. Jason says he imagines the rumors about him and the princess have reached the capital, which makes Eris ask what he expected when he wasn't at all discreet. This makes him clear his throat and move beyond that part of the story. The most important connection he made during his journey was with the dragon. Just like in a fairy tale, he met it after crossing rivers, fields, and mountains. It was such a massive creature that he wondered if he would ever encounter something so immense again in his life. Its body was as white as snow and stunning. According to the dragon, the fear and pressure to fulfill Jason's duty made him seem more monstrous, and that's when he realized something. He was afraid of his own destiny. Jason wanted to live and run far away from there. He hated being forced to live a life that didn't seem to be his own. It was ironic, but he could only express this out loud after facing the dragon, possibly because he believed he would die there. He didn't think he would get out of that situation alive, even after killing the dragon, but the creature's reaction was very different from what he expected. The dragon welcomed him calmly, recognizing Jason as the dragon slayer who had finally arrived. It was just a brief moment in his life, but waiting for him seemed like an eternity. Jason asks if it always knew he was after it, and according to the dragon, his destiny wasn't foretold by God. The dragon had manipulated a priest to tell a false prophecy so it could use Jason to take its own life. The creature said the things it did to die went against the principle of causality, but being the greatest monster of all, it succeeded after much effort. It was clear it paid a great price for its actions too. And saying this, the dragon began to shine even more in white, like a strong light. Until that moment, what Jason saw wasn't the dragon itself, but the realization of his greatest fear. The immense beast suddenly disappeared right in front of his eyes, and left only its heart behind, appearing as a glowing light floating before his eyes. Thus, very slowly and hesitantly, he raised his sword to strike the beast's heart. When he pierced the dragon's heart, the ground began to tremble violently, and Jason felt he was finally free to live his own life. After hearing all this, Eris feels it was a good story, but she couldn't empathize with him. The part about the dragon manipulating the priest to die was quite interesting, making her wonder about the principles of causality, something she could research more about. Eris asks if he knew which priest was manipulated and what the dragon meant by going against the principle of causality. And Jason says that if it was about Father Matthias, he retired and went back to his hometown, but he wasn't sure what the principle of causality was. Even though the dragon answered his questions, it wasn't in a way Jason could fully understand. Jason says he isn't sure a mere human would have understood, even if it had given an explanation. The protagonist wonders if she ended up back at square one, but Jason would find it suspicious if she focused too much on that point with her questions. Finally, she responds that she understood his point and decides she needed to find out more about what she heard later. After a moment of silence, Jason mentions that they seem to have become closer, which caught the protagonist by surprise. He asks if she didn't think it was time for Eris to speak to him less formally so they could become closer. These words make her think that he wished for them to be friends, just like Helena, and Jason's smile only confirmed that. Eris replies that she didn't think they were close enough for that yet. After all, they weren't in a position where they could be friendly with each other. Despite smiling at him, she didn't intend to give in to his puppy dog look after hearing her refusal. She turns her attention to the outside of the carriage through the window, thinking he could lament as much as he wanted, but it wouldn't work to convince her. It doesn't take long for them to arrive at the mansion, and Jason proudly offers his hand to help the protagonist down. The girl accepts the help and holds his hand to get off the carriage. That's when he calls her name and says she shouldn't be so upset with those two, as they lived their lives in the palace and had no experience talking to others. This argument catches her by surprise, and she remains silent before responding that she believes they are both too old to be forgiven just for that. Eris forcefully pulls her hand away from Jason's and steps back, telling him he could find her father in his office. Bidding him farewell with a tense expression, she wishes him a good meeting. After a moment, Jason thanks her and bids her farewell in return. When she enters the mansion, a maid is shocked and asks what happened to her lady's cheek. The protagonist asserts she is fine and that there is no reason to make a fuss about it, despite the maid insisting on knowing if she is really okay. Returning to her room, the maid tends to Eris's face, even though she says she is fine, justifying that the Marquis would be upset if he saw her in that state at dinner. This catches Eris' attention, and the maid explains that there would be a dinner, as it had been a long time since she dined with the Marquis. Although accustomed to acting like Eris, she still felt strange around Marquis Mazirian, making her not at all eager for the dinner. Anyway, in the evening the two eat together in the dining room by the light of the fireplace, and the protagonist spies on the Marquis during the silent meal, until she is surprised when he suddenly calls her by name, asking if she is absolutely sure she won't choose a personal knight. Eris says she believes the knights of her family are more than enough, to which the Marquis responds that she should at least attend the ceremony. Every year, commoners and those of lower class become knights to elevate their status, but their backgrounds prevent them from being chosen. That's because influential families choose knights from other powerful families to maintain good relations with them. But noble knights only care about their own well-being and aren't discreet, so she couldn't trust them to handle sensitive tasks. There are cases where the relationship between the subordinate and the superior becomes murky, and the master ends up serving the knight, which isn't a knight's duty. A true knight is someone you can send to places you cannot go personally. They are people who will do things you cannot tell anyone else and won't tell a soul. The Marquis tells Eris to find a knight who would die in her place if her misdeeds were ever discovered, because that was the duty of a true knight. Eris, who is always scheming something, might indeed need someone like that, making the Marquis know his daughter well to give his advice. But it still seems strange to her because he was speaking directly to her about this. Not to Eris, but to the person behind her body, the one possessing her. No matter how well she could pretend, she could never be the real Eris, whether through subtle habits. Her personal preferences and even the foods she liked were possibly different. It would be impossible for Eris's parents not to notice a sudden change in their daughter and her habits. This makes her consider that she should apologize, perhaps ask for forgiveness for possessing their daughter's body. If she told the truth, she wondered if the Marquis will expel her, or perhaps question where the real Eris had gone, maybe considering she was a witch and torturing her. Considering all this was even more stressful than her previous encounter with Hubris, when the Marquis got up from the dining table. Eris's heart felt heavy because of what she did, despite it not being directly her fault. Feeling guilty for having stolen their precious daughter, especially now under the intense gaze of the Marquis, until he approached and placed a hand on her shoulder. This catches the protagonist's attention to the Marquis's face, but he just touched her shoulder in comfort before silently leaving her completely alone in the silence of the dining room. Eris realizes she misses her own father, lowering her head as sadness overwhelms her. Wondering what happened to her real self in the other world, she might well be dead now, or perhaps still alive. if she was missing, she wonders what her parents would be doing, maybe searching for her. The protagonist covers her face, considering if she could go back, terrified of this possibility and the bad thoughts, just wanting to go home. A maid, who was observing her from a distance, hidden behind the curtains of the room, noticed her sadness. Time passes, and that same maid approached her lady with a blanket in her hands when she saw her sitting on the grass outside. She covered her, asking her to come inside the mansion because it was cold outside, but Eris remained quiet. When the maid insisted, suddenly the protagonist asked if love was really that important. Catching the maid off guard, she continued, asking aloud if she could become empress just by loving the emperor. This maid was Emma, who had worked for the Massyrian family since the day Eris was born, caring for her as her nanny. Emma still remembered the day she held her in her arms for the first time. Her rosy cheeks were enchanting, and Emma thought she was a little angel on earth. She didn't think a baby could be so beautiful, and when she touched her cheek, she realized it was also soft. When baby Eris smiled happily at the touch on her face, the maid felt that in the blink of an eye, she had become someone incredibly dear to her, making her hope she would be the happiest person in the world. Every day, Eris became even more beautiful than before, and this was clear to Emma. People said that Helena, the maid of the imperial palace, was the most beautiful woman in the empire, but Emma was sure it was because they had never seen Eris. At that time, the maid asked Eris to accompany her because the artist who would paint her portrait had arrived. She sat on a couch to pose for her portrait, looking to the side like a model. Her black-blue hair was like the night sky, and her skin radiant like fresh winter snow. Whenever Emma saw her bright eyes and rosy lips like a rose, she felt there was nothing in the world she wouldn't do to make her happy. Emma admired her during the painting of her portrait with a wide smile, thinking she looked like an angel without wings. As the only daughter of one of the most important families, her lady always enjoyed a luxurious life. This made her the target of envy from many others who saw her. One day, Eris asked if the crown prince would attend the ball that day, and Emma agreed, until voices commented on the dress Eris was wearing. People gossiped about how she dared to ask the imperial tailor to make it, acting as if she were already the crown princess. Everyone called her arrogant for acting as if she were already the empress, even without having married Alec yet, which worried Emma. That's when she heard Eris ask the maid to wait there and walked ahead despite the servants' protests. But Eris went to the source of the gossip, saying she hadn't missed hearing those insignificant remarks and wondered who had let such people into the palace. In the end, they were all children of a very well-known family, and Eris's presence made them all nervous for having been overheard. Her look of confidence and superiority did not fail as she accused them of spreading slander in the sacred palace, which was impudent of them. Defaming the crown prince's fiancé was the same as insulting the royal family, and Eris's words made those people tense and nervous. Eris asked what would happen if the emperor knew what had happened in that hall, and this made those people bow and beg her for forgiveness after saying those things. Eris didn't care at all about pleasing those who didn't like her. In fact, Eris was deliberately cruel to these people on purpose, seeming indifferent, but Emma was sure that wasn't how she truly felt, which made her keep praying for her happiness, believing she deserved more happiness than anyone else in that world. One night, while brushing her lady's hair, Emma said she could have informed the Marquis about what the Count's children said, so they would never gossip about her again. Eris replied that she didn't need to get involved, as she had to act cruelly so that none of her servants would be looked down upon either. Emma was surprised and mentioned they were just commoners, which made Eris sigh, saying that people didn't insult her for who she was, but because she worked for Eris. The Marquis' daughter wouldn't allow Emma to be mistreated for something like that, so she should hold her head high wherever she went. But then, when Eris was officially recognized as the crown prince's fiancé, she had to learn imperial etiquette and duties. During that period, although Eris almost never slept, she never stopped visiting the imperial palace. On another day, the maid entered the room and asked how her lady's day had been because she would prepare her bath. But Eris threw herself on the bed, complaining of exhaustion and saying she would just rest. There were rumors that Alec didn't like Eris, but she never mentioned any of this to Emma before. The maid herself never had the courage to ask about it, because it would certainly be an insult to her pride. That's when Emma noticed that her lady had started to wither little by little since then, depressed in her bed. The maid was hanging the winter blankets outside when she was called to come inside the mansion. That day, during her chores, she happened to see Eris while carrying the winter blankets. She watched her sitting on the grass in the distance, alone in her striking red dress. Eris hadn't cried in a long time. Even when people called her cold-blooded or heartless, she never shed tears in front of others. But now she was complaining about how the throne required much more than that. The truth was that the crown prince didn't recognize Eris's hidden efforts. With a pained expression, Eris said she was taught that the role of the empress was to support the emperor, and she worked so hard for that. But even though it hurt, knowing he didn't have to love her, he could at least appreciate her efforts, she mumbled, clutching the blanket over her head. She was hurt because the only thing Helena knew how to do was smile, yet everyone loved her anyway. Seeing her lady in this state, Emma wished she were a witch so she could make it rain and hide her tears. The maid hugged Eris from behind and apologized, wishing she had a way to make her lady's wishes come true. But all she could do now was pray while hugging her to comfort her, with tears in her eyes to share her pain. Deep down, Eris just wanted to disappear from that world, and she wished her desire would come true. Sometimes, miracles happen in the most unfortunate ways, and that's what happened on that fateful day. Emma noticed that Eris didn't tap her ring finger on the table when she was overthinking. She also didn't start her morning with an extra glass of water, and she stopped biting her nails. The maid called her attention while she was distracted, and Eris responded immediately, but even the way she spoke was different from before. She asked if her lady would like to eat something spicy too, and she agreed with a suggestion before thanking her. This immediately struck her as odd, because Eris never thanked her servants that way. This sudden change in her habits and mannerisms made it clear she was no longer the Eris Emma knew in the past. So, who was this new person in Eris's body? If she asked directly, she would probably end up being dismissed as crazy for considering something like that. Emma was worried, wondering where Eris had gone, observing that new person day after day. One day, the maid asked Eris if she remembered when she fell off her horse when she was 6 years old, and the crown prince helped her up. The protagonist, walking ahead of Emma, commented that she was 15 at the time instead of 6, and the maid agreed that was indeed the case. This made her realize that her lady didn't suffer from amnesia, as she remembered her past, and only her subtle habits had changed since then. Eris told her to stop with those stupid questions, and Emma agreed with her. The most suspicious thing of all was that she pretended to be normal despite the visible change. At night, the maid started writing something in her room, thoughtful, drawing a witch and a sketch of Eris in her notebook, considering what would have happened if a witch had possessed her and if she could seek help. She sighed, realizing it wouldn't work, wondering what she should do because she had to find a way to act. That's when she looked out the window and noticed her lady was awake and outside. Emma wondered where Eris was going at that hour of the night, walking outside the mansion. It was dangerous to go out alone in the dark until something caught the maid's attention. In fact, suspicious things had been happening to her lately, but she considered that none of it could have been by accident, until suddenly she widened her eyes at the thought, running to get a light so she could go out in the dark as well. Looking for her lady in the middle of the forest, still barefoot, worried, Emma remembered seeing her lady walking that way into the forest, but lost sight of her, wondering where she had gone. This made her keep calling for Eris, worried because she couldn't lose her in any way, until she noticed the presence of someone behind a tree, and the maid approached, asking if it was Eris. She ran through the bushes and realized it was indeed her lady standing in the middle of the forest. Then she approached her slowly, calling her name when Eris didn't notice, remaining standing with her back under the starry sky. The maid asked what she was doing out there because it was dangerous to go out at night, and the protagonist replied that she wanted to go home. As Emma approached and touched her shoulders, she agreed to return to the mansion, but Eris showed a sad expression, calling for her mother because she wanted to go home. Emma worried that she might be sleepwalking and started mentioning the Marquise, her mother. But Eris interrupted her, saying she wished to eat her mother's kimchi fried rice, which made the maid release her shoulders in surprise. At that point, Emma realized, stepping back slowly from the protagonist, staring at the expression of the person pleading for her mother, that the woman in front of her was not the charming Eris she had known since she was young. She was a lost soul, wandering around in an unwanted dream, whining for her family. Eris shed tears as she asked to be taken home, but Emma realized this truth a little too late. When the girl started to fidget, the maid tried to hold her by the arms to make her stop. squeezing her hands and saying that it was all right because she would do everything possible to help her, repeating that everything would be fine, even under her tears now. Emma repeated over and over that she would be there for her, although now there was only one thing she wanted to ask, and that was to know if there was anyone in this world who made her want to stay. The maids were constantly trying to feed the protagonist despite her lack of appetite. They put the food on the utensils and offered it to Eris, which confused her with the attention. The women insisted she eat because it wouldn't taste as good when it got cold, and Emma insisted she eat because she just needed to chew, and then her favorite dessert would come. Hesitant, she ate even though she didn't feel like doing anything that day and just wanted to stay shut in her room. The news about what happened at the Imperial Palace quickly spread throughout high society. Later, Eris went to meet with various jewel vendors who claimed to have made pieces specifically for her, and everyone would be speechless at her beauty. But the protagonist found herself thinking it was obvious that everyone would act that way because they were talking about how she was slapped by the crown prince. She heard people wondering how Eris could be so calm. Normally she would be officially complaining to the emperor about the incident, perhaps going to Helena's room to turn it upside down. They commented that Eris shouldn't be feeling well because she hadn't been eating much lately. Still, she wondered why she would go after Helena, and on the contrary, she should have gone to Alec while he was sleeping and smashed his head with a bat. Or better yet, she would love to do that now, but she couldn't. Remembering the Marcus's gaze that was etched in her mind that night at dinner, Eris said that was enough for today, closing her fan and stating she would buy all the pieces shown, and they could collect the payment downstairs in the mansion. After withdrawing with her attendants, the vendors waved to her and thanked her. All the Marcus did was pat her on the shoulder, but since that night, she couldn't stop thinking about her family. The protagonist had an ordinary family, though her relationship wasn't especially good. It wasn't bad either, but the truth was she was tired of living in that house. Remembering her past life, she always went shopping alone at the convenience store. Her parents always reminded her how they were struggling financially, so she gave up her dreams and started working as soon as possible. Recalling that her parents enrolled her brother to retake the college entrance exam, even though they were against her going to music college after she worked so hard. Her parents' expectations were too high. If they expected that much, they could have at least shown some interest in her from the beginning. When she returned home from work, her mother asked if she had eaten anything, and she replied that she had just had something light. Then her brother quickly stole their mother's attention, suggesting they eat spicy noodles, even though they didn't have any noodles left. Her father said he could buy some and make them for his son because once he started his prep course, he wouldn't be able to eat at home anymore. At first, she blamed her parents for only caring about her brother and not giving her the attention she deserved. In a phone call, the protagonist said she couldn't come home for the weekend because she was busy with work, and asked her father to check the account because she had transferred some money since it was his birthday. Her mother complained that she had to work even though she was making the spicy roasted chicken she liked so much, and she replied that she was in charge of a new project and was busy. Always refusing her mother's invitations and making excuses not to come back, she hung up a little later and put down the phone. She drank some water and wondered if she really liked spicy roasted chicken that much before, until she received a message that her birthday was coming up, asking what she would like as a present. But she typed that there was nothing she wanted because in her mind, she thought she could see her parents whenever she wanted. Maybe that's why she was so cold with them, thinking they would always be there and taking it for granted. Thinking now in her bed, Eris thinks her brother was a good son to them and always helped their parents with chores. If she could see them again, she would like to make an effort to show how deeply she loved them. Another day, a maid said she needed to go to the palace and that her and Alec's clothes for the night ceremony were ready, which made Eris feel disgusted. Emma was super excited and would love to know the color of her dress, which made Eris think that the ceremony was important in the novel and she would have to attend even if she didn't want to go. The crown prince was not reprimanded for slapping her, and obviously he wasn't even sorry for it. The maids bid farewell to their lady as Eris entered the carriage with a bored look, wondering if that's how cows feel in a slaughterhouse. During her journey, she watched the scenery through the carriage window, thinking that the weather was pleasant and everyone seemed very happy outside in the city. She wondered how she could be the only one who had to live in such a terrible way, having dark thoughts. What did she do to deserve this? Why did she have to be nice to a jerk who slapped her in the face? Eris suddenly ordered the carriage to stop in a way that left the coachman puzzled, and they looked back to confirm her order. Until she raised her voice, yelling to stop the carriage immediately, irritated, and the horses trotted to a halt. Then the protagonist quickly jumped out of the carriage and started running, leaving the knight behind, shouting her name. Hurrying her steps, she thought she had to find a way to shake off the knight somehow. The protagonist passed through several alleys in the city, trying to hide and avoid being found by those responsible for the carriage. Eris wondered if she should hide this way forever, breathing heavily after running so much. If she kept running, maybe the world would eventually give up on her, and she wouldn't be able to return home, which made her expression tense. She begged to be let go, for them to give up on her, because the only person this world needed was Helena after all. Voices shouted when they found Eris and ordered others to chase after her, hastening their steps as they ran through the alleys. This frustrated her because they spotted her too quickly even after trying to hide in a corner. So, she removed her heels and ran quickly through the streets, not wanting to be caught and dragged back to the Imperial Palace. She quickened her pace, hoping to find a decent place to hide where no one would find her, until a hand reached out to her, grabbing her wrist with a strong grip. To her surprise, the one who grabbed her was a small girl who gestured for her to be quiet. She asked if Eris was trying to escape, which left the protagonist confused, and the girl insisted on knowing if she was trying to hide from those men. Despite suspecting the approach, she agreed that she wanted to escape, bringing a smile to the girl's face. Then, she whistled with her fingers suddenly, and several other children came running to the spot. Eris wondered where so many children came from all of a sudden, and at that moment, the knight and the coachman appeared as well. The girl held the protagonist's hand and said her friends would buy some time, asking her to follow. Despite being confused, when the girl guided her and told her to hurry, Eris agreed and ran with her. The two entered a hidden wooden house somewhere, making Eris stop to catch her breath. After leaning against the door, the girl sighed and extended her hand to the protagonist to collect her payment now, saying that a small amount wouldn't be accepted. Eris turned to her confused, asking what she meant by payment. Then she rummaged through her pockets, asking for a moment to find what was there, until the girl asked if it was possible she had nothing. The protagonist felt bad, seeing that the girl was really disappointed that her efforts had been in vain, and took off her earrings, handing them to her, mentioning that if she was accused of being a thief, she shouldn't blame her, but she could keep the earring. This immediately brought happiness to the girl, who broke into a huge, satisfied smile. And she quickly grabbed the earring from Eris's hand, thanking her for the offer without any shame, until they heard knocks on the door, making the girl tremble in surprise. Eris wonders if it is the knight and if they have already found her, hearing the girl whisper to hide, pushing her through the house to hurry, even though she doesn't know where to hide. But the girl helps her into a wardrobe, squeezing her inside while asking her to be quiet. When the girl closes the door to see who was outside, she wonders why the visitor arrived so early, making Eris realize it wasn't the knight. The girl continues asking how the visitor's day was, just as the protagonist peeks through the wardrobe crack, wondering if they were siblings meeting in the room. It was a common-looking man who had just entered, the typical background character that would appear in the novel, until the man raises his voice and asks who was there, immediately noticing something was wrong in the place. Catching the girl by surprise, she nervously tries to cover up, but the man confidently asks who she brought home. As she denies it several times, he just sighs in exhaustion and turns to walk. This makes Eris cover her mouth, realizing the man was heading directly to the wardrobe. She begs him to go away and closes her eyes, hoping he doesn't come there, until a voice rises asking him to wait. But it wasn't enough to stop the man from opening the wardrobe door, finding the protagonist immediately. A super awkward scene makes them stare at each other for a moment, and the man tells her to come out from there, which makes her mentally complain about being caught. After Eris steps out of the wardrobe under the man's gaze, he looks at the girl beside her and extends his hand to her, despite her flinching under his intense gaze. Though he says nothing, he keeps his palm extended towards her, waiting for something. Finally, after a long moment of silence, she reluctantly hands something to the man, muttering, and he returns Eris' earring to her, saying she can keep it, which irritates the girl, making her raise her voice and ask why he is doing this. The protagonist agrees, as she only paid the girl for her help and she didn't steal it from her, and the boy acknowledges this. This leaves Eris silent, just looking at him after seeing his calm and logical reaction. The guy approaches the girl and touches her head, saying that nothing good comes from getting involved with aristocrats, and even with a good reason, they shouldn't accept something so expensive. Eris looks at her own hand, at the earring in it silently, then throws it towards the man, and he catches it just in time before it hits his face, saying it would be more troublesome if he didn't keep it right away. With a smile, Eris states that the earrings were payment for all the help she received earlier and to keep their mouths shut about her being there. It was up to them to trust her, and Eris was willing to offer a payment to hide her there a bit longer. To ensure you don't miss the unfolding of this romance, give a gentle tap on the notification bell, and I see you on the next tale.